Young schoolteacher hid a bandit in her barn. Not knowing he was her missing husband, she thought she was saving a stranger's life that stormy night. But the wounded outlaw bleeding in her barn was the husband she'd been mourning for 3 long years. He didn't recognize the woman she'd become, and she couldn't see the man he'd been forced to become. Sometimes mercy has a price neither soul is prepared to pay. The rain came down like judgment that October night, drumming against the schoolhouse windows with the fury of something long overdue. Mary Catherine pressed her forehead to the cold glass, watching lightning split the darkness over the Nebraska prairie. 3 years of storms had come and gone since Thomas disappeared, but this one felt different, heavier, like it carried more than just water in its belly. She pulled her shawl tighter and turned back to her desk, where tomorrow's arithmetic lessons lay scattered like fallen leaves. The children would arrive muddy and late if this weather held, their small boots tracking half the prairie into her classroom. But tonight the silence felt too thick, too pressing. Even the wind seemed to whisper his name. Thomas. The sound came from the barn, a crash, then something between a groan and a curse. Mary Catherine froze, her hand halfway to the lamp. No animal made a sound like that. She'd learned to recognize the difference between a horse's complaint and a man's pain during her lonely years on the homestead's edge. Her father's rifle hung above the door, loaded but untouched since the day they'd buried him. Mary Catherine had never fired it, never even lifted it down, but her fingers found the cold metal now. The weight surprised her, heavier than grief, lighter than fear. The barn door hung open, creaking on its hinges like a broken prayer. Inside, something moved in the shadows between the hay bales. Lightning flashed, and for one terrible moment, she saw him, a man crumpled against the far wall, dark blood spreading across his shirt like spilled ink. She set the rifle aside and lifted her lantern higher. The stranger was young, maybe 30, with dark hair plastered to his skull and eyes that held too much distance. A bullet had torn through his shoulder, and his face bore the grayish pallor of a man who'd lost more blood than he could spare. But it was his hands that made her step forward. They were gentle hands, even now, pressed carefully against his wound, as if he'd learned to be tender with his own pain. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said softly, the way she spoke to frightened colts. "But you're bleeding." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Bleeding's the least of my troubles, ma'am. Best you pretend you never saw me." "Can't do that." Mary Catherine knelt beside him, setting the lantern in straw. Up close, she could see the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched against pain he wouldn't voice. "My father always said the prairie takes enough from us without our help. Your father sounds like a good man." "He was." She reached for his shoulder, and he didn't pull away. The wound was clean. The bullet had passed through, but infection would set in without proper care. "What's your name?" He hesitated, and she watched something flicker across his features like shadow. "Jesse." "Jesse will do." Mary Catherine nodded, though something about the name felt borrowed, like clothes that didn't quite fit. "I'm Mary Catherine. This is my place now, mine and my students." She gestured toward the schoolhouse, visible through the barn door. "You're safe here, Jesse. For tonight, anyway." As she worked, cleaning the wound with practiced hands, he studied her face in the lamplight. There was something almost hungry in his gaze, as if he were trying to memorize her features. Mary Catherine had grown used to men looking at her, the young widow who taught their children, who lived alone but never seemed lonely. But this was different. This felt like recognition trying to surface through deep water. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly. Mary Catherine's hands stilled for a moment. How many times had she heard those words? How many times had her heart leaped, hoping against hope that somehow, somewhere, Thomas had survived whatever took him from her. "Doi." She resumed her work, wrapping clean bandages around his shoulder. "People say that sometimes faces blend together out here." Jesse closed his eyes, and she saw his throat work as he swallowed something that might have been words. "Yeah, they do." Outside, the storm raged with renewed fury, as if the sky itself were trying to wash something clean. Mary Catherine finished the bandaging and sat back on her heels, studying the stranger she'd chosen to save. In sleep, the harsh lines of his face softened, and she glimpsed the boy he might have been before the world taught him to run. She pulled a horse blanket over him and took up the lantern, but at the barn door, she turned back. Something about the curve of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, tugged at a memory she couldn't quite grasp. Like a song half remembered, beautiful and just beyond reach. "Sleep well, Jesse," she whispered to the darkness. But as she walked back to the schoolhouse through the dying rain, Mary Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just invited more than shelter into her life. Some storms, she knew, changed the landscape forever. Some strangers carried their own lightning. In her kitchen, she brewed coffee she wouldn't drink and stared at the photograph on the mantel. Her and Thomas on their wedding day, young and foolish with hope. His smile was bright as summer, unmarked by whatever darkness had swallowed him whole. Thunder rolled across the prairie one last time, and Mary Catherine touched the glass over her husband's face, wondering why kindness always felt like the beginning of heartbreak. For 3 days, she brought him soup and kindness, never knowing she was feeding the ghost of her own marriage. He read her father's books with hands she'd once held, spoke in a voice that haunted her dreams. The wedding ring on her finger caught the firelight as she told him about her missing husband, and he listened like a man dying of thirst. 3 days passed like hell breath. Each morning, Mary Catherine carried a tin cup of coffee and a bowl of whatever she'd managed to cook on her small stove: cornbread, thin soup, sometimes just beans warmed over the fire. The stranger called Jesse took her offerings with a gratitude that seemed to pain him, as if kindness were a blade turned inward. She found him reading on the second day. Her father's copy of Robinson Crusoe lay open in his lap, the leather binding worn smooth by years of prairie winters. Jesse held it like something precious, his calloused fingers careful with the yellowed pages. When he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, he closed the book quickly, almost guiltily. "Sorry," he said. "Saw it sitting there, and been a long time since I held a book." Mary Catherine set down his breakfast and picked up the volume. The familiar weight of it brought back evenings by the fire, her father's voice reading aloud while her mother mended clothes. Thomas had loved this book too, she remembered, had read passages to her during their brief courtship, his voice animated as he spoke of distant islands and survival against impossible odds. "Keep it," she said, placing it back in Jesse's hands. Papa always said books were meant to be shared. Something shifted in his expression, surprise, maybe, or something deeper. "Your father raised you right. He tried." Mary Catherine settled onto a bale of hay, close enough to check his bandages, but far enough to maintain propriety. "Are you feeling stronger?" Jesse nodded, though she could see the lie in the careful way he moved his shoulder. "Strong enough to ride, if need be." "And where would you ride to?" The question hung between them like smoke. Jesse stared down at his hands, and Mary Catherine noticed how they trembled slightly, whether from weakness or something else, she couldn't tell. "Nowhere in particular," he said finally. "Been drifting for a long time now. Running from something, running to something, maybe, or away from it. Hard to tell the difference sometimes." Mary Catherine understood that kind of confusion. She'd spent 3 years walking the line between hope and acceptance, between the life she'd planned and the one she'd been left to build alone. Every sunrise brought the choice: wait for Thomas to return or finally let him go. "My husband disappeared 3 years ago," she said, the words coming easier than they had in months. Maybe it was the stranger's silence, the way he listened without offering empty comfort. "Thomas Brennan went to work the silver mines near Leadville and just vanished." Jesse's hands stilled on the book's cover. "What happened to him?" "Nobody knows. The mine foreman said there was an accident, a cave-in. Some men died, others were never found." Mary Catherine twisted her wedding ring, a habit that had worn the gold thin. "I keep thinking maybe he's hurt somewhere, trying to get home. Or maybe he found something better than what we had here." "Better than this?" Jesse's voice carried an edge she couldn't interpret. "Better than someone who'd tend to strangers' wounds by lamplight?" "He rose in her cheeks. Our life wasn't much. A sod house, a small claim, big dreams we couldn't afford. Thomas always talked about striking it rich, buy me a real house with glass windows and a piano. Maybe he found his fortune and decided it was easier to start fresh. Any man who'd leave you for money is a fool. The words came out harder than Jesse seemed to intend. Mary Catherine looked at him sharply, seeing something raw in his expression before he turned away. "You don't know me," she said quietly. "Don't know what kind of wife I was. I know you brought soup to a bleeding outlaw without asking his name. I know you sat up 3 nights, making sure fever didn't take me." Jessie met her eyes again, and the intensity there made her breath catch. "I know kindness when I see it, ma'am. Your husband, if he had any sense at all, he'd move heaven and earth to get back to you." Mary Catherine felt tears threaten and blinked them away. Maybe heaven and earth moved first. They sat in silence after that, listening to the wind rattle the barn walls. Jessie opened the book again, but she noticed he wasn't really reading. His eyes kept drifting to her face, as if he were trying to solve some puzzle written in her features. When she rose to leave, he spoke again. "Mary Catherine." She turned, surprised. It was the first time he'd used her name. "Thank you. For this." "For." He gestured weakly at the barn, the bandages, the books. "For seeing a man instead of an outlaw." "What makes you think you're an outlaw?" Jessie smiled, but it was the saddest expression she'd ever seen. The kind of man who gets shot running from a posse doesn't usually make his living teaching Sunday school. That evening, Mary Catherine stood at her kitchen window, watching the lamplight flicker in the barn. She'd cooked extra beans, told herself it was just being neighborly. But the truth sat heavier in her chest. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel alone on the prairie. Inside the barn, Jessie stared at the photograph he'd pulled from his saddlebag, a young woman in a wedding dress, laughing at something beyond the camera's reach. Her face was rounder then, unmarked by solitude, but the eyes were the same. Kind eyes. Forgiving eyes. The eyes of his wife. He traced the image with a fingertip worn rough by rope and reins, remembering the weight of her hand in his, the way she'd hummed while hanging laundry. The mine accident had taken more than his old life. It had stolen his face, carved new lines of hardship and desperation where laughter used to live. Even if she looked directly at him now, would she see the boy who'd promised her the world? Jesse closed his eyes and let the photograph fall to the straw. Some ghosts were better left buried. Some loves were too pure to survive what a man became when the world ground him down to nothing. But as sleep finally claimed him, he could still hear her humming through the barn walls. The same song she'd sung on their wedding night, when the future stretched ahead of them like an unbroken promise. The locket fell from his saddlebag like a thunderclap in the silence. Their wedding photograph stared back at her. Young faces, bright smiles, a love that was supposed to last forever. She whispered his real name into the darkness and watched her dead husband's eyes fill with 3 years' worth of tears he'd been too broken to shed. The locket fell like a stone into still water, ripples of recognition spreading outward until Mary Catherine's entire world tilted sideways. It had tumbled from Jesse's saddlebag when she'd reached for clean bandages, the silver catching lamplight as it hit the barn floor with a sound that seemed to echo forever. She knew that locket, had watched her mother polish it every Sunday, had worn it on her wedding day, tucked against her heart like a promise. Her hands shook as she picked it up, thumbs finding the familiar catch. Inside, 2 faces smiled back at her, young, hopeful, unmarked by the years that would follow. Her own face, round with happiness. And beside her, arm around her waist, eyes bright with dreams he'd never lived to see. "Thomas, don't." Jesse's voice cut through the silence like breaking glass. "Please, Mary Catherine, don't open it." But she already had. The photograph blurred as tears she'd held back for 3 years finally spilled over. Thomas's face smiled up at her, frozen in that moment before the world taught them both how much love could cost. Thomas. The name fell from her lips like a prayer, like a curse. She looked up at the man she'd been calling Jesse, really looked at him for the first time. The face was wrong, scarred now, weathered, carved thin by hunger and running. But the eyes, God help her, the eyes were the same. You're supposed to be dead. Her voice broke on the words. I mourned you. I grieved you. I stood over an empty grave and said goodbye. Thomas, Jesse, whatever name he wore now, like borrowed clothes, closed his eyes as if her words were blows. Maybe I'm dead. Maybe what's sitting here isn't worth calling by that name anymore. 3 years. Mary Catherine stood, the locket clutched so tight the silver edges cut into her palm. 3 years I waited. 3 years I kept your coffee cup on the table, kept your side of the bed empty. 3 years I told myself you were coming home. I wanted to. The words tore out of him like something vital. God, Mary Catherine, every day I wanted to. But look at me. He gestured to his scarred face, his outlaw's clothes, the guns at his hip. Look what I became. I am looking. She stepped closer, and he flinched as if her proximity burned. I'm looking at my husband. Your husband died in that mine. Thomas's voice went flat, empty. What crawled out wasn't fit to touch you, wasn't fit to speak your name. I became everything you were raised to fear. So you let me think you were dead instead? Yes. The simple word hit her like a physical blow. Mary Catherine sank onto a hay bale, the locket still warm in her palm. Outside, she could hear horses approaching, the steady rhythm of a posse that had been hunting too long to give up easily. They're coming for you, she said quietly. Thomas nodded, already reaching for his gun belt. Deputy Morrison's been tracking me for 2 weeks. Good man. He'll see you're safe. Morrison. Mary Catherine's head snapped up. Bill Morrison? You know him? She almost laughed at the cruel irony of it. He's been courting me. Gentle-like, respectful. Asked me to marry him twice now. Thomas went very still. And I told him I was still married. That my husband might come home. Mary Catherine looked at the photograph again, at their young faces full of dreams that had curdled into nightmares. Funny how right I was. The hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather. Thomas stood, favoring his wounded shoulder, and Mary Catherine saw how the years had carved him lean and dangerous. This wasn't the boy who'd promised her a piano. This was a man who'd learned to survive in the spaces between civilization and wilderness. I'll go, he said. Tell them you never saw me. Morrison's a good man. He'll take care of you. Will he? Mary Catherine rose too, and suddenly they were standing close enough to touch, close enough for her to see the silver threading through his dark hair. Will he read to me from Papa's books? Will he remember how I take my coffee, or the song I used to sing while hanging laundry? Thomas flinched as if she'd struck him. Don't what? Don't remember? Don't love the man who left me to grieve alone. Her voice rose, years of buried anger finally finding air. Or don't love him enough to forgive what he became? The horses stopped outside. Voices carried on the night air. Morrison's calm authority, 2 or 3 other men discussing which direction the outlaw might have run. Mary Catherine and Thomas stared at each other across the small space that had become an ocean. Choose, Thomas whispered. Right now, Mary Catherine. Choose the life you deserve, or choose me. But know that choosing me means choosing to run, choosing to live outside the law, choosing to be the wife of a wanted man. Mary Catherine looked down at the locket one more time. In the photograph, she wore white lace and orange blossoms, smiled like a woman who believed love conquered everything. That girl seemed like a stranger now, someone who'd lived in a simpler world where good men stayed good and marriages lasted forever. But love, she'd learned, wasn't simple. Love was choosing to tend to strangers' wounds. Love was 3 years of coffee cups and empty beds. Love was looking at a man transformed by suffering and still seeing the boy who'd once promised her the stars. The barn door creaked open, and Deputy Morrison's silhouette filled the frame, badge gleaming in the lamplight like a fallen star. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Deputy Morrison stood framed in the barn doorway, his hand resting easy on his gun belt, eyes taking in the scene before him. Mary Catherine with tears still wet on her cheeks, the wounded stranger who'd somehow gotten hold of a book, the tension thick enough to cut. Evening, Mary Catherine. Morrison's voice carried the careful politeness of a man who'd seen too much to trust appearances. Heard there might be trouble out this way. No trouble, Bill. Mary Catherine stepped forward, placing herself between Morrison and Thomas. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice stayed steady. Just helping a traveler who got caught in the storm. Morrison's gaze shifted to Thomas, who sat perfectly still against the hay bales, the book closed in his lap. That's so? Mind telling me your name, traveler? Thomas met the deputy's eyes without flinching. Jesse. Jesse Clark. Funny thing, Jesse Clark. Morrison stepped into the barn, his men spreading out behind him like shadows. Been tracking a man, calls himself by that name. Bank robbery down in Cheyenne. 3 men dead. Mary Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. 3 men dead. She looked at Thomas, at Jesse, at the stranger who wasn't a stranger, trying to reconcile the gentle hands that had held her father's book with the violence Morrison described. A lot of men share names, Thomas said quietly. True enough. Morrison drew his gun, not pointing it, just letting it rest in his hand like a natural extension of his will. But not many of them carry a bullet wound in the left shoulder. Not many of them ride a bay mare with a white blaze. And not many of them carry a silver locket with somebody else's wedding picture inside. Mary Catherine's breath caught. The locket lay open in the straw where she dropped it, their young faces smiling up at the rafters like an accusation. Morrison bent and picked it up, studying the photograph in the lamplight. His expression shifted, confusion, then recognition, then something that might have been pity. Well, I'll be damned. He looked from the picture to Mary Catherine, then to Thomas. Thomas Brennan. Thought you were dead, boy. I was. Thomas's voice carried the weight of those 3 lost years. Should have stayed that way. Maybe. Morrison holstered his gun, but his stance remained ready. Mary Catherine, step away from him. No. The word surprised them all, including Mary Catherine herself. She felt Thomas's eyes on her, felt the weight of choice settling on her shoulders like lead. He's my husband, Bill. He's a wanted man. Killed 3 people, robbed a bank, been running with Jake Malloy's gang for 2 years. Morrison's voice gentled. I know this is hard, but you can't protect him. Not from this. Mary Catherine looked down at Thomas, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not as the wounded stranger she'd saved, not as the husband she'd lost, but as the man he'd become in the space between. Dangerous, yes. Broken, certainly. But still hers. What if I could? She said quietly. Morrison frowned. Could what? Protect him. What if I said he never left here? What if I said Thomas Brennan died in that mine 3 years ago, and this is just some drifter who got hurt in the storm? Mary Catherine, what if I said I saw Jesse Clark ride north toward Colorado 2 days ago, and you just missed him? The silence that followed was different than before, charged with possibility and terrible consequence. Morrison studied her face, and she could see him weighing law against loyalty, duty against the debt he felt he owed her family. You'd be lying to a federal marshal, he said finally. Would I? Mary Catherine picked up the locket, closed it with a sharp click. Thomas Brennan is dead, Bill. Has been for 3 years. You said so yourself, saw his name on the missing list after the mine accident. Thomas watched her with something like wonder, as if she were performing a miracle he'd stopped believing in. Morrison holstered his gun completely, then signaled his men to lower theirs. Jesse Clark rode north, you said? 2 days ago. I gave him some food, pointed him toward the Colorado line. Mary Catherine's voice grew stronger with each word of the lie that felt more like truth than anything she'd spoken in years. He seemed like a decent enough sort. Polite. Read to me from Papa's books while his horse rested. And this wounded man, this is just someone the storm brought to my door. Name of... She looked at Thomas, saw him nod almost imperceptibly. Name of James. James Walker. He'll be moving on soon as he's strong enough. Morrison studied them both for a long moment that felt like Judgment Day. Finally, he touched the brim of his hat. Well then, I reckon we'd best ride north. Trail's getting cold. He paused at the door. Mary Catherine? That offer still stands. When you're ready to stop waiting for ghosts. After they'd gone, Mary Catherine and Thomas sat in the lamplight, the weight of what she'd done settling between them like dust after a storm. "Why?" Thomas asked finally. Mary Catherine looked at their wedding photograph one more time before slipping the locket into her apron pocket. "Because 3 years ago, I promised to love you for better or worse. Reckon this qualifies as worse. We can't stay here. Morrison's decent, but he's not stupid. He'll figure it out eventually." "I know." Mary Catherine stood, brushing straw from her skirt. "There's a teaching position open in California. Town called Mercy. Been thinking about it for months." Thomas, James now, she supposed, smiled for the first time since she'd known him. "Mercy. That's fitting. Seems like a good place to start over. If you want to." He reached for her hand, hesitant, as if he'd forgotten how. When their fingers touched, Mary Catherine felt the calluses that hadn't been there before, the scars that mapped 3 years of running. But underneath, she still felt the boy who'd once promised her everything. "I want to," he said quietly. "God help me, I want to try." Outside, dawn was breaking over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of possibility. Mary Catherine squeezed her husband's hand and wondered if redemption always felt this much like falling. Terrifying and beautiful and completely beyond control. Some loves, she thought, were worth losing everything for. Some second chances were worth the price of starting over in the dust.